Christmas Eve didn't knock. It crashed into the mansion like a cold, quiet wave, snow tapping the tall windows, wind pressing against the stone, and a silence so clean it felt like it had been polished. Victor Romano sat at the head of a dining table meant for 12. There was one plate, one glass, one chair pulled out. Everything else stayed perfectly aligned, like the house itself was afraid to breathe too loudly around him. The grandfather clock in the hall ticked with a steady confidence, as if time had somewhere to be. Victor didn't. He stared at the candle in the center of the table, unlit. He could have lit it. He could have filled the house with lights and music, could have thrown a party, could have invited 100 people who would have shown up just to say they'd been there, but none of them would have mattered. His phone buzzed again, face down beside his plate. He didn't touch it. The screen lit the table edge with a blue flash. Another message, another "Merry Christmas, boss." Another photograph of a crowded room full of smiling faces. Victor didn't need reminders that the rest of the city knew how to be warm. He took a slow breath and rolled his shoulders back, like posture could keep loneliness from sitting on him. Across the table, a place setting for no one stared back at him. A laugh almost escaped his throat, small, sharp, without joy. This was ridiculous. He owned half of Chicago's shadows. He controlled deals that moved like tides. People lowered their voices when he walked into a room, even if he was smiling, even if he was polite, even if he didn't raise his hand, didn't raise his voice, didn't need to. And yet here he was, alone, in a house too big for a single heartbeat. The scent of rosemary and butter drifted in from the kitchen. His chef had cooked anyway, out of habit or fear or simple professionalism. Victor had dismissed the staff hours ago, told them to go home, told them to be with their families, told them he didn't need anything. They'd smiled like he was lying, then left like he was telling the truth. Victor glanced toward the hallway. The front door was far, but he could picture it perfectly. The heavy wood, the ironwork, the keypad panel, the quiet security cameras watching for a threat that didn't exist tonight. He wasn't in danger. He was just alone. He pushed his chair back with a soft scrape and stood. His black dress shirt fit him like it had been tailored to his patience. No tie. The top button undone. His sleeves rolled up slightly, not because he was casual, but because he was tired of feeling like a man in armor. He walked into the kitchen. It was bright, warm, and spotless. Too perfect, like the room wasn't used for living, only for serving. Stainless steel gleamed under recessed lights. The stove was off. The counters were empty except for one covered platter, a folded note, and a single mug of coffee that had gone cold. Victor stopped in front of the platter and lifted the lid. A plate had been left for him. Sliced roast, mashed potatoes, green beans, and a piece of cornbread. Not fancy, not decorated, just food, real food. Like someone had wanted him to actually eat, not just pretend to. He stared for a moment, then picked up the note. Mr. Romano, I know you told everyone to go home. I did too, but I didn't like the idea of you sitting at that huge table with nothing. So I asked the chef if I could make a plate. He said yes. Merry Christmas. Grace. Victor read it twice, slowly. Grace, his new maid, Grace Miller. She'd started 2 weeks ago, right before the city went full holiday madness. He remembered the interview, polite, calm, eyes steady. Mid-20s, average height, dark hair usually pulled back. She'd worn a simple sweater and jeans, no makeup that screamed for attention, no perfume trying to impress. But her presence had done something anyway, not in a cheap way, not in a pretty girl in the house way, in a the room feels different when she's in it way. Victor hadn't expected to notice. He didn't expect to notice anyone anymore. He'd trained himself out of it, like a bad habit. Yet, he'd noticed her. She moved through the house like she belonged there, even while trying to make herself invisible. She spoke when necessary, and when she did, her voice had a warmth that made the marble floors feel less cold. And apparently, she left notes. Victor set the note down. The coffee mug sat beside it. He picked it up and took a sip out of reflex. Cold. He grimaced slightly, then, to his own surprise, chuckled. Of course. A man feared by people who'd done terrible things. And he was standing in his kitchen drinking cold coffee like a college kid pulling an all-nighter. He put the mug down and stared at the plate again. His stomach tightened. Not from hunger, but from the quiet thought behind it. Someone had thought of him. Not because they wanted something. Not because they feared him. Because they didn't want him to be alone at Christmas. Victor's jaw tightened. He wasn't used to kindness that didn't come with a price tag. He covered the plate again, not ready to eat, then walked back out, turning off the kitchen light behind him. The mansion swallowed him with its silence. He headed toward his study instead of the dining room. The study was his comfort zone. Dark wood, leather chair, a wall of books he rarely read but liked to own. The fireplace was lit, because routine was routine. He sat behind the desk and opened his laptop. Numbers, reports, messages. The screen filled with information that mattered to other people. Victor stared at it for a full minute. Then he closed the laptop. He leaned back, one hand resting on the arm of the chair, the other at his jaw. He listened to the crackle of the fire. He listened to the clock. He listened to the house. And somewhere in that quiet, he realized he could still smell rosemary. Grace's plate was sitting in the kitchen like a soft accusation. He rubbed the bridge of his nose. His mind tried to do what it always did, control the situation. He could call someone. He could schedule a meeting. He could fly somewhere. He could buy something. He could fix the feeling with movement and power. But none of that would change the fact that, tonight, he didn't want a crowd. He wanted warmth. And that was dangerous, because warmth came from people. And people always left. His phone buzzed again. Victor didn't even glance at it. Instead, he stood and walked down the hallway toward the staff wing. It wasn't something he normally did. Not because it was forbidden, his house, his rules, but because he didn't like crossing lines. Staff were staff. He was him. He stopped near the laundry room where soft light spilled under a partially open door. A voice drifted out. Grace. She was humming, not a song he recognized. Just a simple melody, like she didn't even notice she was doing it. Victor hesitated. Then he knocked once. The humming stopped instantly. A second later, the door opened. Grace stood there in a soft gray sweater and dark leggings, her hair down for once, falling in loose waves over her shoulders. She looked surprised to see him, then quickly composed herself. Mr. Romano, she said, stepping back. I'm sorry. I thought everyone was gone. I was just finishing up a few things. Victor's eyes flicked to the small stack of folded towels behind her. Her cheeks were slightly flushed, either from warmth or from being caught in a quiet moment. She wasn't wearing jewelry, no lipstick, just natural, and for some reason that made her feel more real. It's fine, Victor said. His voice sounded rougher than he intended. He cleared his throat. You left a plate. Grace blinked. Then her expression shifted into something cautious, like she was bracing for reprimand. Yes, she said carefully. I hope that wasn't inappropriate. It wasn't. He cut in, quick. Too quick. Grace paused. Her eyes searched his face like she was trying to figure out which version of him was standing in front of her tonight. Victor exhaled slowly. Thank you. Her shoulders relaxed just a little. You're welcome. He nodded once, like that was the end of the interaction, but his feet didn't move. Grace tilted her head. Did you eat? Victor's mouth tightened. He hated that question, not because it was rude, but because it was human. The kind of question someone asked when they cared. No, he admitted. Grace stared at him for a beat, then her brows lifted. Why not? Victor gave her a look that normally shut people down. Grace didn't flinch. She just looked at him like he was a man who hadn't eaten dinner, not a man who owned half the city's silence. Victor felt something shift in his chest. Annoyance, maybe, or something else. I wasn't hungry, he said. Grace's lips pressed together. You're lying. Victor's eyes narrowed. Excuse me? Grace swallowed, then immediately regretted it. I'm sorry, I shouldn't. But Victor didn't look angry. He looked interested. No one talked to him like that. Ever. Grace tried to recover with a weak smile. I didn't mean it like... I just mean, you seem like someone who forgets to take care of himself. Victor leaned a fraction closer, his presence filling the doorway without him trying. And you think it's your job to remind me? Grace's cheeks warmed. No, I mean, kind of. I'm your maid, not your mother. Victor's lips twitched. Was that a joke? He almost smiled. Almost. Grace saw the twitch, and emboldened by the fact that he hadn't thrown her out, she added, If I start nagging you about vegetables, please fire me. Victor let out a quiet sound, half a laugh, half disbelief. Grace blinked, surprised she'd gotten anything out of him. He looked at her, really looked. In the soft light, her eyes were a deep brown with tiny gold flecks, like warm whiskey. Her skin looked soft. Her mouth looked distracting. Victor immediately hated his own thoughts. He stepped back, putting space between them. You can go, he said. Grace's brows drew together. I was going to. I just needed to finish these. Victor nodded toward the towels. Leave them. She hesitated. I don't mind. I do, Victor said. Grace opened her mouth, then closed it. For once, she listened without arguing. She reached for her coat from a hook on the wall, slipped it on, and grabbed her bag from a chair. When she moved, her hair brushed her shoulder, and Victor had the sudden, stupid impulse to reach out and tuck it behind her ear. He didn't. He kept his hands to himself like a man with discipline. Grace looked up at him. Are you okay tonight? Victor's jaw tightened. I'm fine. Grace didn't move. She stood there like she was weighing something in her mind, something risky. Then she took a breath and said quietly, You don't have to be alone, you know. Victor's eyes sharpened. Grace, I'm not trying to be weird, she said quickly. I know what it's like. Victor studied her face. What it's like to be alone. Grace nodded. To be surrounded by space and still feel empty. Victor didn't answer, because if he answered honestly, he'd say yes. And he couldn't say that to his maid. Grace shifted her bag strap on her shoulder. I'm going home, she said. I made dinner for myself. It's nothing special. Victor's mind jumped to an image he didn't ask for. Grace in a small kitchen, moving around in socks, humming that quiet melody, stirring something on the stove. Warm, real, the opposite of this mansion. Grace looked up at him again, and there was a softness in her gaze that didn't belong in his world. If you want, she said, voice gentle but firm, you can come have dinner at my home. Victor froze. Not because the offer was shocking, because the way she said it wasn't flirtation. It wasn't pity. It wasn't strategy. It was simple. It was kind. It was an open door. Victor's throat tightened. He didn't speak for a second, and in that silence Grace seemed to realize what she'd done. Her eyes widened slightly. I'm sorry, she said, rushing. That was probably inappropriate. I didn't mean... I just thought... Victor held up a hand, stopping her. Grace went quiet. Victor stared at her as if she'd placed a match in his palm. A small flame, something he could either blow out or let grow. He had rules, he had lines, he had control, and yet the idea of walking back to that empty table made his stomach turn. Grace waited, nervous, her fingers tightening around her bag strap. Victor's voice came out low. You live alone? Grace blinked, surprised by the question. Yes? In the city? Not far, she said. A few blocks from here. I take the bus. Victor frowned. At night? Grace lifted her chin. I can handle myself. Victor stared at her, then muttered, almost to himself, Of course you can. Grace's eyes narrowed. Was that sarcasm? Victor's gaze lifted slowly to meet hers. No. Her breath caught. Just for a second. Victor noticed. He hated that he noticed. He stepped back, making room for her to pass. Go, he said, his voice controlled again. It's cold. Grace hesitated. So, that's a no? Victor didn't answer, because he didn't know. Grace swallowed. "Okay," she said softly. "Merry Christmas, Mr. Romano." She walked past him, her shoulder brushing his arm by accident. Or maybe not an accident. Victor went still at the contact. Her warmth lingered for a fraction of a second, and it felt like someone had pressed a hand against ice. Grace paused at the end of the hallway, turned back, and gave him a small, uncertain smile, like she wasn't sure if she'd just made a mistake or started something. Then she left. The front door closed somewhere in the distance with a heavy final sound. Victor stood alone in the hallway, the air suddenly colder than before. He could still smell her shampoo. Clean, lightly sweet, nothing expensive. Just her. He walked back to the dining room without thinking, stared at the massive table, and felt his chest tighten with something that wasn't anger and wasn't pride. It was want. Not hunger. Not power. Want. His phone buzzed again. Victor finally picked it up. Not to answer messages, not to check business, just to look at the time. 9:12 p.m. The city outside was alive, families laughing, couples holding hands under Christmas lights, people going home to warmth. Victor stared at the empty chair across from him. Then he glanced toward the front door. He could stay. He could eat the plate she left and pretend it was enough. Or he could step out into the snow, knock on her door, and cross a line he'd never crossed before. Not as a boss, not as a man feared by everyone, but as a lonely man who'd been offered a seat at a small table. Victor's hand tightened around the phone. And the question sat in the room with him, heavy and unavoidable. Was he really going to spend another Christmas alone, when Grace Miller had just given him a way out? Victor didn't return to his study. He stayed in the dining room, standing beside that long table meant for crowds, staring at the empty chair across from him as if it had made a decision on his behalf. The house was too quiet, too perfect, too cold in a way heat couldn't fix. He went back to the kitchen and lifted the lid from the plate Grace had left. The food smelled real, warm, like someone had made it for a person, not a boss. He set the lid down again. Tonight wasn't about eating. Victor grabbed his black coat from the entryway closet and stepped outside. Snow dusted the driveway and the iron gate, and the wind cut through the air like it had been waiting for him. He didn't call the driver. He didn't signal security. He just walked, hands in his pockets, collar up, breath turning to smoke. Chicago was alive. Couples under Christmas lights, families carrying bags and laughing. A man dragging a Christmas tree down the sidewalk like it was the happiest burden in the world. Victor followed the address he remembered from paperwork he'd barely glanced at. A brick building, older, smaller. A string of blinking lights around the entrance, cheap and uneven, but somehow charming. He stopped at the buzzer panel and stared for a second longer than necessary. Then he pressed. Miller, 3B. A pause. A voice soft and surprised through the speaker. Hello? It's Victor, he said. Silence. Then a sharp inhale. Mr. Romano? Victor, he corrected low. I'm outside. Another pause, longer this time, like her brain needed a moment to catch up with reality. Okay, wait, I'm coming down. The door buzzed open. Victor stepped into the warm lobby and waited near the mailboxes. It smelled like pine cleaner, old wood, and someone's dinner. Footsteps hurried down the stairs. Grace appeared on the landing and froze when she saw him. Her hair was down, loose over her shoulders. She wore a simple red sweater and black leggings, barefoot in fuzzy socks like she'd forgotten it was winter because she was too stunned. You actually came, she said. You invited me, Victor replied. Grace blinked fast, then stepped aside. Come up. It's not fancy. Victor followed her up the stairs. The building creaked with every step, and he realized he hadn't heard a normal house sound like that in years. Grace fumbled her keys, cheeks flushed, and opened the door. Warmth spilled out, not just heat, but life. Her apartment was small, clean and cozy. A tiny Christmas tree sat on a side table, slightly crooked. A blanket lay on the couch. A vanilla candle flickered on the coffee table. It wasn't polished. It was lived in. Victor stepped inside and paused. Grace shut the door behind him and leaned against it for a half second, like her body needed support. Then she straightened and tried to sound casual. "This is it," she said. "My glamorous life." Victor looked around slowly. "It's warm." Grace gave him a look. "Yes, that's the goal." He took off his coat and hung it on a hook by the door. Without it, his presence filled her space in a way that made Grace shift, suddenly aware of him. Victor noticed the quick flick of her eyes over him. Too fast to be obvious, too honest to be meaningless. Grace rushed toward her small kitchen corner. "I made pasta," she announced, a little too loud. "Nothing special." "It smells good," Victor said. She turned, narrowing her eyes. "You didn't eat the plate I left you, did you?" Victor lifted a brow. "Are you going to scold me?" "Yes," she said instantly. Something almost like a smile tugged at his mouth. "No," he admitted. "I didn't." Grace folded her arms. "Why not?" Victor held her gaze for a second too long. "I wasn't hungry." Grace stared, then blurted, "You're lying." Victor's eyes sharpened. For most people, that would have been the end of the conversation. For Grace, it was the beginning. She realized what she'd said and immediately backtracked. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean. You look like someone who forgets to take care of himself." Victor studied her, quiet. "And you think that's your responsibility?" Grace huffed, half embarrassed, half stubborn. "No, but I also don't like watching someone sit alone at a table big enough for a wedding." Victor didn't answer. Grace pointed toward a small table by the window. "Sit, before I change my mind." Victor sat. The chair creaked. He looked down at it like it had offended him. Grace laughed once, surprised by her own bravery. "It's old. Be nice." "I am being nice," Victor said. Grace brought 2 plates and set one in front of him. Creamy pasta, black pepper, parsley, cheese. Simple, comforting. She sat across from him, then suddenly looked shy, like the reality of him being there had finally reached her. Victor picked up his fork and took a bite. It was good. Not fancy. Not trying too hard. Just satisfying. He looked up. "This is good." Grace exhaled, shoulders relaxing. "Thank you." They ate in a quiet that didn't feel awkward. The radiator hissed. Somewhere in the building, a TV played softly. Outside, snow drifted past the window, streetlights turning it into glitter. Grace watched him, curiosity in her eyes. "You look like you don't know how to act." Victor didn't look up. "I'm fine," Grace snorted. "Sure." Victor finally met her gaze. "Is this your hobby? Talking back to me?" Grace's lips twitched. "No, cooking is my hobby. Talking back is just an added feature." Victor's eyes narrowed, amused against his will. "An added feature." Where Grace leaned forward slightly, voice softer. "You don't have to be Mr. Romano here." Victor's throat tightened. "Then who am I?" Grace stared at him like she was deciding whether to be honest. "You're a man," she said quietly. "Who's been alone too long." Victor set his fork down. The words hit too close because they were true. He forced his voice steady. "Tell me about you." Grace blinked. "Me?" "You," Victor repeated. "Not your work. Not your schedule. You." Grace looked down at her mug of water, fingers tightening around it. "I grew up in Indiana," she said. "Small town. I wanted out. I moved here for a fresh start." "Family?" Victor asked, careful. Grace's jaw tightened. "Not really." Victor didn't push. He just nodded, and something in her expression softened, relief that he wasn't digging for pain. Grace tilted her head, trying to change the tone. "What about you? Were you born intimidating?" Victor's mouth twitched. "Chicago." Grace smiled. "That explains it." For the first time that night, Victor let a quiet sound escape. Half laugh, half disbelief. Grace froze, eyes widening like she'd seen a rare animal. "Oh my God, that was a laugh." "Don't make it weird," Victor said. Grace grinned. "Too late. It's going on my resume." Victor shook his head, and the simple motion felt unfamiliar. Normal. Grace stood to clear the plates. "Dessert," she announced. "I have apple pie." Victor lifted a brow. "You just happen to have pie?" Grace stared at him like he'd insulted her honor. "It's Christmas. I'm not a monster." She returned with 2 slices, set one in front of him, and sat again. Victor took a bite. Warm apples, cinnamon, flaky crust. It tasted like a memory he didn't have. Grace watched him. "Well, it's good," Victor said. Her smile turned genuine, bright in a way that made his chest feel tight. For a moment, he forgot to look away. Grace noticed his stare and shifted, suddenly unsure. "What?" Victor's voice dropped. "You're different." "Different from what?" she asked, cautious. "From everyone who's ever been around me," Victor said, simple and honest. Grace's smile faded. "That sounds like a compliment and a warning." "Maybe it's both," Victor admitted. Grace held his gaze, then said firmly, "I'm not trying to get anything from you." "I know," Victor said immediately. The speed of his answer surprised her. It surprised him too. Grace's voice softened. "Then why are you looking at me like that?" Victor's throat tightened. "Because I don't want to leave. Because your apartment feels like oxygen. Because you make my life feel human." Instead, he asked, "Why did you invite me?" Grace didn't hesitate this time. "Because you looked lonely." Victor's jaw clenched. "I'm not." Grace lifted a hand, stopping him gently. "I know what people think you are, but I'm not talking to what people think. I'm talking to you." The air between them grew heavy, quiet, warm, charged. Grace broke it first, forcing a lighter tone. "Also, you looked like you needed pasta." Victor's eyes narrowed. So this was charity. Grace gasped dramatically. "How dare you? This is high-end Italian charity." "It wasn't Italian," Victor said. "But you are," Grace blurted, then immediately froze, realizing she'd crossed into personal territory. Victor didn't flinch. He just stared at her, and the calm in his eyes made her breathe again. "Coffee?" Grace offered quickly. Victor nodded. "Yes." She stood, turned her back to him, and started the small coffee machine. Victor watched her hands move, confident, practical, gentle, domestic in a way that made him want something he hadn't allowed himself to want. Grace brought him a mug and set it down. Her fingers brushed his hand. This time, it wasn't an accident. Both of them froze at the contact. Grace's breath caught. Victor's pulse jumped, sharp and undeniable. Grace sat back down, cheeks warm, eyes flicking away for a second. Victor wrapped his hands around the mug, as if the heat could keep him steady. Grace took a sip of her own coffee and tried to sound casual again. "So, do you always spend Christmas alone?" Victor met her gaze. "Usually." Grace frowned. "That's sad." "It's quiet," Victor replied. Grace shook her head slowly. "Quiet isn't the same as okay." Victor stared at her, and for a second, the control he'd built his life on felt thin. Grace's voice dropped. "I've been alone too," she admitted. "It doesn't make you strong. It just makes you tired." Victor's jaw tightened. Then, against instinct, he said the truth. "So have I." Grace looked at him like she hadn't expected him to be real. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full. Grace stood, suddenly needing motion. "I should clean up." Victor rose too. "I'll help." She spun toward him. "No." "Why not?" "Because you're you," she said, flustered. "And you don't wash dishes in my kitchen." Victor stepped closer, not touching, just filling the space. "Tonight, I do." Grace swallowed hard, then muttered, "Fine. But if you break a plate, I'm charging you." "Fair," Victor said. They stood side by side at the sink. Grace washed. Victor dried. Their hands brushed twice, 3 times, each touch small, each one louder than words. Grace tried to joke through it. "Do you know how to do that?" Victor glanced at her. "I'm not helpless." "Prove it," she challenged. Victor dried the plate slowly, deliberately. "Satisfied?" Grace's smile softened. A little. Victor's gaze slid to her face. Only a little? Grace met his eyes, and the teasing faded. No, she whispered. More than a little. The dish towel hung between them like a thin excuse. Victor's fingers tightened around it. Grace's breath hitched. Victor lifted his hand, slow, giving her time to stop him, and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. Grace froze like the whole building had gone silent. His knuckles brushed her cheek. Her eyes lifted to his, wide and vulnerable. Victor's voice came out rough. Tell me to stop. Grace didn't. She whispered, Don't. Victor leaned in and kissed her, careful at first, like he was afraid she'd disappear. Then deeper, warmer, as Grace's hands curled into his shirt and pulled him closer. Her body trembled, not with fear, but with shock at how right it felt. She broke the kiss first, breathless, forehead against his chest. That just happened, she whispered, half laughing. Yes, Victor said. Grace looked up at him, eyes shining. I don't want to be a Christmas Eve mistake. Victor's gaze locked on hers. Then you won't be. A beat. Grace nodded slowly. Okay. Victor took his coat from the hook, and Grace walked him to the door barefoot, arms wrapped around herself like she was holding on to the warmth. Victor paused with his hand on the knob. Will you let me see you tomorrow? Grace blinked. Tomorrow is Christmas. Exactly, Victor said. Her smile turned soft and certain. Yes? Victor leaned in and kissed her again, short, gentle, promising. Merry Christmas, he murmured. Merry Christmas, she whispered back. Victor stepped into the hallway and closed the door. He stood there for a second, staring at it like it had just rewritten his life. Then his phone buzzed. A message from his head of security. Call me. Now. It's urgent. Victor's steps slowed on the stairs. His jaw tightened as he stared at the screen, the warmth of Grace's apartment still on his lips. Because whatever was urgent had the power to reach into the one good thing he'd felt in years. And Victor Romano had a sharp, immediate certainty. He wasn't going to let anything touch her. Victor didn't sleep. He went back to his mansion, walked through rooms that suddenly felt even emptier than before, and stood at the edge of his bed staring at the untouched pillows like they were an insult. Grace's apartment still clung to him. Warm air, vanilla candle, her laugh, the taste of cinnamon on her lips. And then there was the message. Call me. Now. It's urgent. He'd returned it as soon as he stepped outside her building. Talk, Victor had said, voice low. His head of security, Ian Parker, didn't waste time. We have a situation. Victor's spine tightened. Where? Not at the house. Not yet, Ian said. But someone's been asking questions. Victor's jaw clenched. About me? A pause. About her. Victor's blood cooled. Grace Miller, Ian added. Your new maid. Victor stood still in the snow outside her building, staring at her warm window on the third floor as if he could shield it with his body. Who? Victor asked. We don't know, Ian said. It started as small. A guy at a corner store asking what time she leaves work. Another person asking the building super if she lives alone. And today, someone tried to get her address by calling the agency that placed her. Victor's voice turned sharp. Did they give it? No, Ian said quickly. But it means someone's trying. Victor's grip tightened around his phone. Why would anyone care about her? Ian's answer was careful. Because she works for you, and you don't have weak spots, not obvious ones. Victor's jaw flexed. He hated that it was true. You're saying she's a target, Victor said. I'm saying she could become one, Ian replied. And tonight, Christmas Eve, someone might assume you're distracted. Victor's gaze lifted to the street, to the families passing, to the lights and snow and laughter. The world looked so harmless, but he knew better than anyone how quickly harmless could turn. What do you recommend? Victor asked. Ian hesitated. More eyes on her, quietly, no uniforms, no scaring her. Victor's voice went cold. Do it. Ian lowered his tone. Victor, what's going on? You never... Do it, Victor repeated, and the call ended. Now in his bedroom, Victor stared at the darkness beyond the window. Snow fell softly. The city slept. He didn't. Because for the first time in years he had something to lose. He had someone. Victor's phone lit up again. Messages, holiday greetings, business updates. He ignored all of it and opened his contacts. Grace. He'd saved her number earlier, after she'd texted the address when he asked for it, in case he got lost. The fact that she'd given it so easily had warmed him then. Now it made his chest ache. He stared at the screen, thumb hovering. He could call her. But what would he say? Hi, Merry Christmas. Also, someone might be watching you. No, not tonight. Not like that. Not after the softness she'd offered him. He wouldn't drop fear into her apartment like a bomb. He set the phone down, then picked it up again. Because he couldn't not. He typed one sentence. Did you get home okay? He waited. The typing bubble didn't appear. Minutes passed. His jaw tightened. Then his phone buzzed. Yes, I'm okay. Are you? Victor stared at her words, heart beating harder than it should. He typed back. I'm fine. See you tomorrow. Another pause. Then, tomorrow. Don't be late. Victor exhaled a quiet laugh he didn't want anyone to hear. He locked his phone and stared at the ceiling until morning. Christmas Day arrived with pale light and fresh snow. Victor stood in his kitchen, staring at his coffee like it held answers. His mansion was silent again, but it didn't feel the same. It felt temporary, like an empty stage waiting for someone to step into the scene. He checked his phone. No new alerts, no new threats. But Victor didn't relax. He dressed like he had somewhere important to be. Black jeans, a charcoal sweater, a coat that made him look like trouble even when he wasn't trying. He didn't wear a tie. He didn't want armor today. Ian called once. 2 guys near her building, Ian said. Not close enough to spook her. We're tracking them. Victor's jaw clenched. Keep them off her. We will, Ian said. But Victor, if she doesn't know, she won't be careful. Victor stared out the window at the snow-covered driveway. I'll handle it. He ended the call and drove himself, not in an SUV, in a simple black sedan that didn't scream power. He parked a block away from Grace's building and walked through the snow like he belonged on the street with everyone else. Families passed him carrying gifts. A kid waved at him for no reason. Victor nodded back, slightly confused by normal life. Grace opened her building door before he even buzzed, like she'd been watching. She stepped out in a cream-colored coat with a scarf wrapped around her neck. Her cheeks were pink from the cold. Her hair was down again. And for a second Victor forgot how to breathe. You're not late, she said, eyes bright. Victor's mouth twitched. I didn't want to test your rules. Grace grinned. Good choice. She walked closer, then stopped, suddenly shy, like she wasn't sure if she was allowed to touch him in public. Victor didn't hesitate. He leaned down and kissed her, quick, soft, but clear. Grace's eyes widened after, like she was still surprised he could be gentle. Then she smiled, warm and real. Hi. Hi, Victor said, voice low. Grace looked past him. So, what's the plan? Are you going to let me cook again? Victor lifted a brow. Do I have a choice? Grace laughed. No. She turned and started walking down the sidewalk. Victor fell into step beside her, hands in his coat pockets, shoulders close enough that their arms brushed. The contact sent heat straight through him. Grace glanced up at him. You didn't sleep, did you? Victor's eyes narrowed. How do you know that? You look like you fought a war with your pillow and lost, Grace said, dead serious. Victor exhaled, almost amused. I slept. Grace hummed skeptically. Sure. Victor looked at her. I was thinking. Grace's expression softened. About what? Victor's mind flashed to Ian's warning. The Watchers. The danger he refused to bring into her day. He chose the safest truth. About last night, he said. Grace's breath caught and her gaze dropped to the snow under her boots. Me too. They walked in silence for a few seconds, the city around them loud with holiday life, their little bubble quiet and warm. Grace finally spoke, voice careful. So, what happens now? Victor glanced at her. What do you want to happen? Grace's lips parted. Then she closed them, thinking. I don't want to pretend nothing happened, but I also don't want to be a secret. Victor stopped walking. Grace stopped too, startled. What? Victor looked at her with calm intensity. You won't be a secret. Grace searched his face. That's a big promise. Victor's gaze didn't move. I don't make small promises. Grace swallowed, and Victor saw the vulnerability in her eyes. She wanted to believe him. She was just afraid of being foolish. Victor stepped closer, lowering his voice. I want to see you. I want to take you out. I want to know you. Grace's breath shook. Victor. He didn't touch her yet. He gave her space to say no, space to step back. Grace didn't. Instead, she whispered, Okay. Victor's jaw tightened with something that felt like relief. Grace's smile flickered. Then she tried to lighten it because she was Grace. But I'm warning you, my life is not fancy. Victor's mouth twitched. Good. Grace blinked. Good? I have enough fancy, Victor said. I want real. Grace stared at him like no one had ever said that to her. Then she laughed softly, eyes shining. Okay, Mr. Rial, let's go. They kept walking. Grace led him to a small diner on a corner street. Nothing glamorous, just warm lights and the smell of coffee. She pushed open the door, and a wave of heat and noise hit them. People eating pancakes, kids whining, a waitress calling orders. Victor paused at the entrance, scanning by instinct. Grace noticed. Relax, she whispered, amused. The only thing that attacks here is the syrup. Victor's eyes narrowed. You're sure? Grace smiled. I'm sure. They sat in a booth by the window. Grace slid in first, then Victor sat across from her. For a second, he just watched her hands, how she took off her gloves, how she tucked hair behind her ear, how she rubbed warmth back into her fingers. The waitress came over, cheerful. Merry Christmas. What can I get you? Grace answered easily. Coffee and pancakes. The waitress looked at Victor, eyebrows lifting slightly, like she recognized him or at least sensed his presence. Victor ordered simply. Coffee. Grace stared at him. That's it. Victor glanced at her. You said I have to eat. Grace pointed at the menu. Then eat. Victor's mouth twitched again. Fine. He ordered eggs and toast like a man following rules he didn't fully understand. When the waitress left, Grace leaned forward, eyes playful. See? You can be normal. Victor's gaze locked on hers. I'm only normal because you're making me. Grace's smile softened. Then I'll keep making you. The words landed between them like a promise. Victor felt his chest tighten. He kept his voice steady. You shouldn't. Grace blinked. Why? Because you don't know what I am. Because you don't know what people do to things I care about. Victor didn't say that. He said, because you'll get tired. Grace stared at him like he was being ridiculous. I'm not tired of you. Victor's eyes darkened. You don't know me. Grace's voice dropped, gentle but firm. Then let me. Victor held her gaze, and the urge to reach across the table and pull her close hit him hard. He didn't. Not here. Grace's pancakes arrived. Victor's eggs came. Grace immediately stole a piece of his toast without asking. Victor stared at her hand. Was that necessary? Grace chewed innocently. Yes. Victor's eyes narrowed. You're stealing from me. Grace swallowed and leaned back, smug. Merry Christmas. Victor exhaled a quiet laugh, shaking his head. Grace smiled like she'd won something, and she had, because she'd made him laugh in public. After breakfast, they walked again, slower now. Grace pointed out little things. Decorated windows, carolers, a dog wearing a Santa hat. Victor listened, pretending he wasn't enjoying it as much as he was. At one corner, Grace stopped to watch a street musician playing a holiday song on a saxophone. The tune was cheerful, soft. Grace glanced at Victor. Do you ever do things like this? Just be out? Victor's voice was low. Not often. Grace's eyes softened. You should. Victor looked at her. With you? Grace's cheeks warmed. Yes. Victor's gaze dropped to her mouth for a second. Grace noticed. Her breath hitched, and she looked away like she was trying to remember how to stand. Victor stepped closer, lowering his voice. Come home with me. Grace's eyes snapped to his. Your mansion? Victor nodded, watching her carefully. Not as my maid. Grace's throat moved as she swallowed. Then as what? Victor's voice was rough, honest. As the woman I kissed last night and can't stop thinking about. Grace's cheeks turned pinker than the cold could explain. She looked down, then back up, trying to be brave. Okay, she whispered. Victor's chest tightened, relief and desire mixing together. They started walking toward his car. And then Victor saw it. Across the street near the corner store, two men. Not dressed like tourists, not dressed like families. Their eyes were too alert, their bodies too still. One of them glanced at Grace, then quickly looked away like he'd been caught. Victor's entire body hardened in an instant. Grace noticed the change. What? She asked softly, confused. Victor forced his face to stay calm, forced his voice steady. Nothing, he said. But his eyes stayed on the men, and his mind made one thing painfully clear. This wasn't going to stay simple for long, because someone had already noticed that Grace Miller mattered to Victor Romano, and Victor was going to have to decide soon how to protect her without pushing her away. Victor didn't react like a man on the street. He reacted like a man who could read danger from a single glance. His shoulders stayed relaxed, his face stayed calm, but everything inside him tightened into focus. The two men across the street weren't laughing, weren't shopping, weren't hurrying home with gifts. They were standing still in a way that didn't match Christmas. Grace noticed the shift in him and lowered her voice. What is it? Nothing, Victor said, too smooth. Grace's brows pulled together. That's not a nothing face. Victor took a slow breath and forced his tone to stay gentle. It's just instinct. I don't like strangers staring. Grace glanced over his shoulder, searching. Who's staring? Victor stepped slightly closer, blocking her view without making it obvious. Come on, he said, nodding toward the car. It's cold. Grace hesitated, still trying to see. Victor reached for her glove and guided her hand into his. The gesture looked casual, almost sweet, but to him it was also control, placement, protection. Grace's eyes flicked down to their hands, and her tension softened for a second. Okay, she whispered. They crossed the street. Victor didn't look back again, but he felt eyes tracking them. He opened the passenger door for Grace and waited until she was inside. He shut it gently, then walked around to the driver's seat, posture calm, mind sharp. He drove away like it was nothing. But his hands gripped the steering wheel a little tighter than usual. Grace watched him from the passenger seat. The heater hummed, warming the car fast. She tucked her scarf closer and studied his profile like she was trying to solve him. You're quiet, she said. Victor kept his eyes on the road. I'm thinking. Grace's voice softened. About what? Victor didn't want to lie to her. He also didn't want to throw fear into her day. He chose a smaller truth. About you coming to my house. Grace blinked. That's what you're thinking about? Victor glanced at her for half a second, then back to the road. Yes. Grace's cheeks warmed. You sound like it's a big deal. It is, Victor said simply. Grace looked out the window at the snow-covered streets, then back at him. Because I'm your maid. Victor's jaw flexed. Because you're Grace. Her name sounded different in his mouth. Lower. Heavier. Like it meant more than it should. Grace didn't speak for a moment. Then she asked quietly, Are we doing something wrong? Victor slowed at a stoplight. His gaze met hers briefly. Do you feel wrong? Grace swallowed. No. Victor's voice dropped. Neither do I. The light changed. He drove on. Grace stared at him as if she wasn't used to a man saying things that clearly. No games, no vague promises. just direct. When they reached his property, the iron gate opened smoothly, cameras turning with a soft mechanical movement. Grace's eyes widened as the driveway stretched toward the mansion. "I've never been here during the day," she admitted, almost whispering. Victor parked near the front steps and got out first. He opened her door and offered his hand. Grace took it. Her fingers were warm inside her glove. Victor felt it through the fabric anyway. They walked inside, and the house greeted them with quiet, polished air. Everything looked perfect, like it was designed to impress someone who didn't exist. Grace stepped into the entryway and turned slowly, taking it in. "It's beautiful." Victor watched her face, waiting for the next part, the discomfort, the distance, the reminder of their different worlds. Grace didn't pull away. She just looked around, then looked back at him. "But it's so quiet." Victor's throat tightened. "Yes." Grace took off her coat and hung it carefully, like she respected the space but refused to be intimidated by it. "It needs music," she said. Victor lifted a brow. "You want to redecorate my life already?" Grace smirked. "I want to keep you from turning into a statue." Victor's mouth twitched. "Fair." Grace wandered toward the living room drawn by the fireplace. The room was large, elegant, and empty in the way expensive things often were. Grace walked to the mantel and saw the stockings, unused, perfectly arranged, probably put there by someone on staff out of obligation. She touched one lightly. "Do you do Christmas here at all?" Victor leaned against the doorway, watching her. "Not really." Grace looked back at him, eyes soft. "That's going to change." Victor's chest tightened. "Because you say so?" Grace nodded like it was obvious. "Yes." Victor shook his head, amused despite himself. "You're going to be trouble." Grace smiled. "Good." Victor walked closer, slower now, letting the tension between them become something they didn't have to ignore. "Are you hungry?" he asked. Grace's eyes flicked to his mouth. "Not for food." Victor froze for a split second. He didn't expect her to say it out loud. Grace realized she had, and her cheeks went pink. She tried to save herself with humor. "I mean, unless you have pancakes." Victor stepped closer, voice low. "Grace." She looked up at him, breath shallow, eyes bright and nervous. Victor's hand lifted slowly, giving her time to stop him. His fingers brushed her cheek, warm skin, soft. He felt her lean into his touch without thinking. "You're sure?" he asked, quiet. Grace swallowed. "About you?" Victor nodded once. Grace whispered, "Yes." Victor kissed her. This time it wasn't in a small kitchen with dishes between them. It was in his home, in his world, with firelight reflecting in the windows and the snow falling outside like the city was holding its breath. The kiss started slow, almost careful. Then it deepened, and Victor's control shifted into something else. Attention, devotion, need. Grace's hand slid up his sweater, fingers curling at his shoulders. Victor's arm wrapped around her waist, pulling her closer until her body pressed against his like she belonged there. Grace broke the kiss first, gasping softly. Her forehead rested against his chest. "This is insane," she whispered. Victor's mouth brushed her hair. "Do you want me to stop?" Grace lifted her head. "No." Victor's eyes darkened. "Then don't call it insane." Grace exhaled a shaky laugh. "Okay, it's dangerous." Victor went still. He didn't like that word. Grace noticed and corrected softly. "Not like that. I mean, emotionally. Because I already feel attached." Victor's jaw tightened. He lifted her chin gently. "Say what you mean." Grace's eyes searched his. "I mean, I don't want to be a temporary feeling for you." Victor stared at her like he couldn't believe she'd even doubt it. "I don't do temporary," he said, voice firm. Grace's breath caught. "That sounds like a promise." Victor nodded. "It is." Grace blinked, and her eyes turned glossy for a second like she was fighting emotion. She looked away, embarrassed by it. Victor stepped closer, forcing her to look at him again. "Hey." Grace's voice trembled. "I'm fine." Victor's eyes narrowed, but his tone stayed gentle. Stop saying that when you're not. Grace let out a small laugh. Caught. You sound like me. Victor's mouth twitched. I learned from the best. Grace stared at him, then smiled softly. Okay, she whispered. I'm not fine. I'm scared. Victor's body tightened. Of me? Grace shook her head quickly. No, of how good this feels. Victor's eyes softened in a way that made her breathe again. He took her hand and led her toward the couch by the fire. They sat, close, knees touching. Grace's fingers played with the edge of his sleeve like she didn't know what to do with her hands. Victor watched her for a moment, then said quietly, Tell me what you want. Grace's voice came out small. I want you to look at me like you did last night. Like I'm the only thing in the room. Victor's gaze locked on hers. You are. Grace's breath caught. Victor. He leaned in and kissed her again, slow, unhurried, making her melt into him. Grace's hand slid to the back of his neck. Victor's fingers moved along her waist, then up her back, holding her like he had no interest in letting go. When they finally pulled apart, Grace was breathless, cheeks flushed, eyes dazed. She stared at him and whispered, half teasing, half serious, You don't act lonely when you kiss. Victor's voice was rough. That's because you're here. Grace's throat moved as she swallowed. Then don't let me be the only reason you're alive. Victor stared at her, surprised by the depth of her words. Grace touched his cheek, gentle. You matter even when you're alone. You just forgot. Victor's chest tightened so hard it almost hurt. He didn't have a smooth response, so he did the only honest thing. He kissed her again, softer this time, like gratitude. Grace smiled into it. They stayed by the fire for a while, talking in low voices, laughing quietly, touching hands, touching faces, like they were trying to memorize each other without admitting they were doing it. Grace eventually glanced around the huge room and frowned. This place needs a kitchen smell, she declared. Victor lifted a brow. A kitchen smell. Grace stood, suddenly energized. Yes, like cookies, or something warm. You know, normal. Victor watched her, amused. Are you about to take over my kitchen? Grace pointed at him. Yes, and you're going to help. Victor stood slowly. You're very demanding for someone who works for me. Grace walked toward the kitchen with confident steps. I don't work for you right now, she called over her shoulder. Right now I'm saving you from becoming a Christmas ghost. Victor followed, the corner of his mouth lifting. A ghost. Grace opened cabinets like she owned them. Do you have flour? Victor stopped near the doorway. Grace, this is not a bakery. Grace shot him a look. Do you have flour? Victor stared. Probably. Grace sighed dramatically and started opening drawers. Of course. A man with 10 fireplaces and no flour. Victor crossed his arms. I have flour. I just don't know where it is. Grace looked at him like he'd admitted something tragic. Okay. New mission. We find flour. Victor watched her rummage. This is what you do for fun? Grace grinned. No, for fun I steal your toast. Victor's mouth twitched. I remember. Grace finally found a bag and held it up like a trophy. Ha! Victor shook his head. Congratulations. Grace turned on the oven. We're making cookies. Victor glanced at the clock. It's Christmas afternoon. Grace nodded like it proved her point. Exactly. Victor moved closer behind her as she read a simple recipe from her phone. His chest brushed her back slightly when he leaned over to look, and Grace went still. Victor's voice dropped near her ear. You're tense. Grace swallowed. You're too close. Victor's hand slid to her waist, fingers warm through her sweater. Do you want me to move? Grace's breath hitched. No. Victor smiled against her hair. Good. Grace tried to focus on the recipe, but her voice turned shaky. Okay, we need sugar. Victor's fingers tightened slightly at her waist. Sugar. Grace nodded quickly. Yes. Sugar, not whatever you're doing. Victor kissed the side of her neck, just a brief soft press of his lips. Grace gasped, grabbing the counter. Victor. His voice was low and calm. You said you wanted me to look at you like you're the only thing in the room. Grace turned her head, eyes wide. Not while I'm holding flour. Victor's gaze dropped to her mouth. Then put the flour down. Grace stared at him, then let out a shaky laugh. You're impossible. Victor's eyes stayed on hers. And you're here. Grace's teasing faded into something tender. She reached up and touched his cheek. Yes, she whispered. I'm here. Victor kissed her. Slow, deep, making the world narrow to heat and breath, and the smell of vanilla from her hair. When they pulled back, Grace rested her forehead against his. If we burn these cookies, she whispered, I'm blaming you. Victor exhaled a quiet laugh. I'll accept responsibility. They managed to make cookie dough between kisses and stolen touches, laughing when Grace accidentally dusted flour onto Victor's black sweater. Grace held up her flour-covered fingers. Oops. Victor stared at the white smudge on his chest. You did that on purpose. Grace's eyes sparkled. Maybe. Victor stepped closer, voice low. Then you're going to clean it. Grace's cheeks warmed. With what? Victor's gaze dropped to her mouth. Use your imagination. Grace froze, then swallowed, trying to stay brave. You're not fair. Victor's hand slid to the back of her neck. Neither are you. The oven beeped, snapping them back to reality. Grace hurried to shape the cookies onto a tray, cheeks still pink. Victor stood behind her like a quiet shadow, watching her with a look that made her feel seen. When the cookies finally baked, the mansion changed. The air smelled sweet and warm. Cinnamon and butter. It smelled like life. Grace pulled the tray out and inhaled happily. There, she said. Now it's a real house. Victor looked at her, then at the tray, then back at her again. It is, he said quietly, because you're in it. Grace turned, softness in her eyes. Victor. He stepped closer and brushed a thumb over her cheek. Stay for dinner. Grace blinked. Here? Victor nodded. With me. Grace's smile grew. Okay. Victor's chest loosened, and for a second he let himself believe it could be that simple. Then his phone buzzed in his pocket. He ignored it. It buzzed again. Grace noticed the vibration, her smile fading slightly. Is that work? Victor forced his face calm. It's nothing. Grace stared at him, not convinced. Victor. He didn't want to lie again. He also didn't want to ruin this. So he did something he rarely did. He told her part of the truth. Sometimes, he said slowly, my life doesn't stay quiet when I want it to. Grace's eyes softened with concern. Is something wrong? Victor watched her, his chest tightening with the urge to protect her from even knowing. His phone buzzed a third time. Victor finally pulled it out and glanced at the screen. A text from Ian Parker. They followed you. We lost one. The other is still in the area. Victor's blood cooled. Grace saw the change in his eyes instantly. What? She whispered. Victor locked the phone and slid it back into his pocket, forcing his voice steady. Grace, he said carefully, I need you to promise me something. Her brows knitted. Promise what? Victor stepped closer, hands gentle on her arms, eyes fixed on hers. If I ask you to do something, he said, low and serious, you do it. No arguing, not because I'm your boss, because I need to know you're safe. Grace's lips parted, confusion mixing with worry. Safe from what? Victor didn't answer yet, because the moment he did, everything would change. And the worst part was, he could already feel it coming. The peace, the warmth, the cookies, the kisses, all of it balanced on a thin line. And someone out there had just started pulling. Grace stared at Victor like she was trying to decide whether he was joking. His hands were gentle on her arms, but his eyes weren't playful anymore. They were sharp, focused, protective in a way that made her stomach flip, half warmth, half worry. Victor, she said softly, what are you talking about? He kept his voice low. Just promise me. Grace's brows pulled together. I don't like promises when I don't understand what I'm promising. Victor held her gaze, fighting the urge to tell her everything, and the stronger urge to tell her nothing. He chose the safest truth he could offer without breaking her peace. People watch me, he said. Not the way you're thinking. Not like I'm in danger every second. But sometimes my name brings attention. And when someone wants leverage, they look for the nearest door. Grace's throat moved as she swallowed. And you think that door is me? Victor's jaw tightened. He didn't deny it. I think you're close to me, he said. That's enough for the wrong person to get curious. Grace stared at him, breath shallow. Are you saying those men outside the diner? Victor cut in quickly, soft but firm. Don't think about them too much. I have people who handle things quietly. I just need you to listen if I ask. Grace's eyes narrowed slightly. You have people. Victor exhaled once, like he hated admitting it. Yes? Grace looked down, then back up. So what do you want me to do? Victor's shoulders eased a fraction, relieved she wasn't panicking. For tonight, stay here. Grace blinked. Here? At your house? Victor nodded once. You don't have to, but I want you close while we make sure it's nothing. Grace's cheeks warmed, but her eyes stayed serious. Close for safety, or close because you want me close? Victor didn't hesitate. Both. Grace's lips parted. The directness hit her the same way it had hit her in the diner. No games, no confusion, just truth. She tried to lighten it because fear wasn't her style. Okay. But if I stay here and you start acting like I'm a fragile little thing, I'm leaving. Victor's mouth twitched. Noted. Grace pointed at him. Also, I'm not sleeping in a creepy mansion room where everything is white and silent. Victor raised a brow. Creepy. Grace nodded firmly. Yes, if your guest room looks like a fancy hospital, I'm out. A quiet laugh escaped him. Short, surprised. Grace froze, pleased. There it is again. Victor shook his head, as if he couldn't believe he was letting her win. Come on. He guided her down the hall, not dragging her, just leading. Grace followed, still scanning the house like she expected it to swallow her whole. The guest suite was warm, dark wood, soft lighting, a thick comforter, a small sitting area, and, most importantly to Grace, a bookshelf with actual novels, not just decoration. Grace walked in and turned slowly. Okay, she admitted. This is not a hospital. Victor leaned against the doorway, watching her face relax. Good. Grace glanced at him. Are you staying up all night at the door like a guard dog? Victor's eyes narrowed. I don't. Grace held up a hand. Victor, if you say I'm fine, I'm charging you. He stared at her, then exhaled through his nose. I'm not fine. Grace's expression softened. There. See? That wasn't painful. Victor stepped closer, lowering his voice. Grace, if this feels like too much, tell me. I won't be offended. Grace looked up at him. The firelight from the hallway touched the edge of his face, turning him less like a legend and more like a man who hadn't slept. I'm scared, she admitted, but I'm also not running. Victor's chest tightened. Why? Grace shrugged, but her eyes were honest. Because you're not asking me to be brave for you. You're asking me to be careful. That feels different. Victor stared at her like those words landed somewhere deep. He reached out slowly, fingers brushing her cheek. I don't want anything to touch you. Grace's breath hitched. Then keep me close. Victor went still. Grace realized what she'd said, and her cheeks warmed, but she didn't take it back. Victor leaned in and kissed her, soft at first, then deeper, like he'd been holding himself back all day and couldn't anymore. Grace's hands slid up his sweater, pulling him in, and for a moment the house disappeared. There was only warmth, breath, and the steady beat of something new between them. When they pulled apart, Grace whispered, half teasing, So, safety plan includes kissing? Victor's voice was rough. It helps. Grace smiled, then glanced around. Okay, if I'm staying, I need pajamas. Victor blinked. Pajamas. Grace nodded like it was obvious. Yes, unless you want me to sleep in my jeans like a hostage. Victor's mouth twitched. I can have someone bring your things. Grace's eyes narrowed. Someone, like a person. Victor hesitated. Yes. Grace folded her arms. Are they going to be weird? Victor's tone turned dry. They're afraid of me. They don't have time to be weird. Grace sighed dramatically. Great. So I'll meet your mysterious people while wearing cookie flour in my hair. Victor's eyes softened. You look good with it. Grace froze. Stop saying things like that. Victor stepped closer. Why? Because, she whispered, it makes me forget how to breathe. Victor's gaze dropped to her mouth. Then I'll slow down. He kissed her again, gentle, unhurried, making her melt against him until the tension in her shoulders finally eased. A soft knock sounded at the hallway door. Victor didn't move, but his eyes sharpened. Grace noticed immediately. Another knock. Careful. Victor turned his head slightly. Ian. Ian Parker's voice came through the door. 2 minutes. Grace blinked. That's him? Victor nodded once, then looked back at her. Stay here. Grace lifted a brow. No arguing, remember? Victor's mouth twitched. Exactly. He stepped out and closed the door quietly behind him. Grace stood still in the guest suite, heart pounding, listening. She could hear low voices through the thick door. Victor's calm tone, Ian's controlled urgency. She couldn't make out most of it, but one phrase slipped through like a thread. Still in the area. Grace's stomach tightened. She paced once, then forced herself to stop. She wasn't going to spiral. Victor had asked for trust, not panic. A few minutes later, the door opened again. Victor walked in alone. Grace searched his face. What's happening? Victor didn't sugarcoat, but he kept it gentle. Someone followed us earlier. My security is handling it. It might be nothing. It might be someone trying to figure out my routines. Grace's voice turned small. And now I'm part of your routine. Victor crossed the room, stopping close enough that she could feel his warmth. You're not a routine, he said. You're you. Grace swallowed. Victor. He brushed his thumb over her cheek. Listen to me. This doesn't have to be your problem. If you want distance, I'll give it. If you want to quit, I'll make sure you land somewhere safe and comfortable. No questions, no pressure. Grace stared at him, stunned by how carefully he offered her an exit. You'd let me go? She asked. Victor's jaw tightened like it hurt. Yes. Grace's eyes softened. That's the first time a powerful man has ever offered me freedom without making me pay for it. Victor went still. Has someone made you pay before? Grace hesitated. This was one of those moments where the air changed, where a small truth could become a big one. Grace took a breath. I didn't come to your house because it was my dream job, she admitted quietly. Victor's eyes sharpened. Then why did you come? Grace looked down at her hands, then back up. Because I needed a clean restart. I needed quiet. And I thought working somewhere strict would keep my life simple. Victor's voice stayed steady. What happened, Grace? She swallowed hard. My ex. He wasn't violent. Not like that. But he didn't know how to let go. He kept showing up, calling, promising he'd change. And when I said no, he tried to make my life difficult. Victor's body tightened, a controlled kind of anger. Did he hurt you? Grace shook her head quickly. No. He was just exhausting. He knew how to make everything heavy. Victor exhaled slowly, eyes dark. Does he know where you are? Grace's voice dropped. He didn't. I changed my number. I moved. I picked a job that didn't connect to my old life. Victor stared at her, then said low and clear, he won't come near you. Grace's eyes widened. Victor, don't. He cut her off gently. I'm not saying I'm going to do something crazy. I'm saying I won't allow anyone to scare you again. Grace's breath shook. She didn't realize how much she needed to hear that until it was said. She whispered, Okay. Victor stepped closer, his hand settling at her waist like he belonged there. Stay, he murmured. Grace nodded. I'm staying. Victor kissed her, slow, grounding, making her feel safe inside her own skin. When he pulled back, her eyes were glossy. Grace tried to joke, voice shaky. If your security guy is outside right now, he's going to need therapy. Victor's mouth twitched. Ian has seen worse. Grace stared. Worse than you being romantic? Victor deadpanned. Much worse. Grace laughed, the sound easing the room again. Victor's gaze softened. I'm going to have someone bring your bag from your apartment, and I'm going to stay in the room across the hall. Grace blinked. Across the hall? Victor nodded. So you can sleep without feeling watched. Grace tilted her head. And so you can sleep without pretending you don't want to be near me. Victor's eyes narrowed. You're too observant. Grace smiled. I told you, I'm charging for lies. Victor leaned down, kissing her once more. Good night, Grace. Grace's voice came out soft. Good night, Victor. He stepped out, leaving the door slightly ajar. Just enough to tell her she wasn't alone, not enough to steal her space. Grace changed into the borrowed soft t-shirt Victor had brought from a drawer. Plain, clean, warm. It smelled like him, faintly, and it made her cheeks heat for reasons she didn't want to analyze. She slid into bed, listening to the mansion settle. For the first time in a long time, she felt safe. Then her phone buzzed. She hadn't gotten notifications all day because it was on silent. She reached over, expecting a random holiday message. Unknown number. Her stomach tightened as she opened it. Merry Christmas, Grace. I heard you found yourself a new place. Her breath stopped. Her fingers went cold around the phone, because only one person wrote like that. And she hadn't told Victor the part she'd been trying hardest to forget. Her ex didn't need an address to find her. He only needed a reason. And now, she had Victor Romano. Grace sat up so fast the blanket slid to her waist. The room was warm, soft, quiet. Until it wasn't. Her phone screen glowed in the dark, and those words burned like a warning. Merry Christmas, Grace. I heard you found yourself a new place. Her throat went dry. Her fingers trembled around the phone as if it had suddenly become heavy. She stared at the message again, hoping she'd misread it. She hadn't. A second message arrived before she could even breathe. Don't pretend you can disappear from me. Grace's stomach twisted. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to stay quiet. The mansion was silent. Victor was across the hall. His security was outside somewhere. She was safe. And still, fear crawled up her spine like it remembered her too well. She stared at the open doorway, the small crack of light from the hall, and fought the urge to run to Victor immediately. Not because she didn't trust him, because she didn't want to be the problem. She didn't want to drag the mess of her past into the one good thing she'd found. Grace's thumb hovered over the keyboard. She could reply. Tell him to stop. Tell him she'd call the police. But she knew how this worked. He wanted a reaction. He wanted to know she was scared. Grace locked her phone, hands shaking, and swung her legs out of bed. She padded to the door in her socks, cracked it open a little more, and looked across the hall. Victor's door was open too, just a sliver, like he'd left it that way on purpose. Grace took a breath and crossed the hall quietly. She knocked once, barely a sound. The door opened immediately. Victor stood there fully dressed, like he hadn't slept at all. His eyes were sharp, but the moment he saw her face, they softened. Grace, he said quietly. What happened? Her voice came out thin. I got a message. Victor's jaw tightened instantly. From who? Grace swallowed. My ex. Victor didn't move, but something changed in him, like warmth snapped into steel. He stepped aside. Come in. Grace walked into his room. It was darker than hers, simpler, like he didn't live here so much as survive here. Victor closed the door behind her, then turned, watching her carefully. Grace held her phone out, fingers still shaking. I didn't answer. Victor took the phone gently, read the messages once, then a second time. His jaw flexed. He handed it back. You did the right thing. Grace let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. Victor, I didn't tell you everything. He stepped closer, voice low and steady. Tell me now. Grace's eyes burned with emotion she didn't want to show. He found me before, even when I changed my number, even when I moved. He has this way of slipping into my life like a bad smell you can't get rid of. Victor's eyes narrowed, not at her, at the idea of someone doing that to her. Grace rushed on, trying to stay in control. He wasn't violent, not physically, but he kept pushing, showing up, talking like I owed him my attention. He'd make little comments, like he knew things, like he was watching. Victor's voice stayed calm, but it was colder now. What's his name? Grace hesitated. She hated giving that man space in the air, but Victor needed it. Ethan Caldwell, she whispered. Victor repeated it once, quietly, like he was storing it. Ethan Caldwell. Grace's hands twisted together. Victor, I don't want you to do something reckless. Victor's gaze locked on hers. I'm not reckless. Grace almost laughed, because the man was a storm in a tailored sweater, but she didn't. She just pleaded softly. Promise me you won't make this worse. Victor stepped closer, and his hands settled on her arms, grounding her. Grace, he said, slow and firm, nothing you tell me makes you a problem. Her eyes filled despite her effort. It feels like it does. Victor's voice softened. Look at me. Grace lifted her gaze. Victor brushed his thumb under her eye, catching a tear she didn't want to admit was there. You're not ruining anything, he said. He's the one trying to ruin you. That ends now. Grace's breath shook. How? Victor didn't answer with threats. He answered with action. He picked up his phone and made a call. Grace watched him, heart pounding. Ian, Victor said quietly, I need you inside. Now. He listened, then added, bring whatever you have on Ethan Caldwell, and I want a patrol near Grace's building immediately, discreet, and I want her number flagged for any unknown contact attempts. Grace blinked. You can do that. Victor ended the call and looked at her. I can do more. Grace's throat tightened. I don't want you to scare him and make him angry. Victor's eyes softened again, and his tone turned gentle. Grace, he is already doing what he wants. Your fear won't control him, but my boundaries will. Grace stared at him, the steadiness in his voice sinking into her bones like warmth. Victor took a slow breath. Did he ever put his hands on you? Grace shook her head quickly. No. Did he ever threaten you? Victor asked. Grace hesitated. Not directly. He'd say things like, I know where you work, or I know where you like to go. He made it sound casual, but it never felt casual. Victor's jaw tightened. That's a threat. Grace swallowed. I guess. Victor stepped closer until she could feel his body heat. He didn't touch her immediately, as if he wanted permission. Grace whispered, I hate that you're seeing this side of my life. Victor's voice was low, certain. I want to see all of you. Grace blinked. Even the ugly parts? Victor's eyes held hers, especially those. Her breath caught. That was the kind of love she'd never had, love that didn't flinch. Grace's shoulders sagged, exhaustion taking over now that she wasn't holding everything alone. I just wanted a clean start, she whispered. Victor's hand finally moved, sliding behind her neck, pulling her gently closer until her forehead rested against his chest. You have it, Victor murmured, his chin brushing her hair. And you'll keep it. Grace's voice trembled. What if he shows up here? Victor's arms tightened around her. He won't. Grace pulled back slightly, looking up at him. How can you be so sure? Victor's gaze went sharp, but his voice stayed calm. Because this house is watched. Because I'm not alone in my world. And because if he tries to reach you through me, he'll learn quickly that you're not a door he can use. Grace's lips parted, emotion rising again. Victor. He kissed her forehead. Breathe. Grace tried. Her chest rose and fell, shaking at first, then steadier. A knock came at the door. Victor didn't let go of Grace as he called out, Come in. Ian Parker entered. eyes moving quickly across the room. Mid-30s, clean-cut, calm. He glanced at Grace with quiet respect, not curiosity. "Mr. Romano," Ian said. Then to Grace, gentle, "Ma'am." Grace blinked at the ma'am, startled. Victor kept his hand at the small of her back. "Talk." Ian held up a tablet. "Ethan Caldwell, age 32. No major criminal record. A few complaints filed, harassment, unwanted contact. Nothing stuck because the victims didn't follow through." Grace looked away, embarrassed and angry at herself. Victor's voice turned firm. "Not victims. Women he targeted." Ian nodded. "Yes, he works in sales, moves around a lot. The number that texted her is a burner, but we can track the pattern." Grace's voice came out small. "So, he's done this to other women." Ian's expression stayed neutral, but his eyes were honest. "Yes." Grace's stomach turned. "Great." Victor's tone was steady. "What's the plan?" Ian looked at Victor. "We can involve legal channels, restraining order, documentation. We can also quietly make it clear he's being watched." Grace's eyes widened. "If he thinks he's being watched, he'll get worse." Victor turned to her immediately. "We do it smart," he said gently. "Not loud, not dramatic." Grace swallowed. "I don't want him near me." Victor's voice lowered. "Then he won't be." Ian added, "We'll place a discreet unit near your building, Grace, and we'll set up a new phone number for you. Unlisted, secured. Only a few people will have it." Grace looked at Victor. "You?" Victor nodded. "Me." Grace's cheeks warmed for a second, even in the middle of fear, because the idea of him being the one person allowed into her private world felt intimate in a strange, grounding way. Ian continued, "We also recommend you don't go back to your apartment for a few days." Grace's mouth opened. "I have—" Victor cut in, calm. "I'll get whatever you need. You won't go alone." Grace glanced at him, seeing how serious he was. She nodded slowly. "Okay." Ian looked at Victor. "One more thing. The two men from earlier, we identified one. He's connected to a low-level crew that's been trying to get your attention. They're fishing." Victor's eyes narrowed. "They want leverage." Ian nodded. "Yes." Grace stiffened. "Victor, is this because of you?" Victor turned to her instantly. "This is because of them," he said. "Not you." Grace shook her head, panic rising. "But I don't want to be a weakness." Victor stepped closer, lowering his voice until it was only for her. "Grace, you're not a weakness. You're the first good thing I've let myself want in years." Her breath caught. Victor's eyes didn't move. "And I'm not letting anyone touch it." Grace stared at him, overwhelmed by the tenderness and the force in the same sentence. Ian cleared his throat softly, giving them a moment without making it awkward. "I'll coordinate everything," he said. "Mr. Romano." Victor nodded. "Go." Ian left. The room fell quiet again. Grace stood there, hands still twisted together, fear and relief mixing until she didn't know what she was feeling. Victor stepped closer, gently uncurling her fingers with his own. He kissed her knuckles, slow, intimate. Grace blinked at the softness. "You don't have to do that." Victor's voice was low. "I want to." Grace swallowed. "I'm sorry." Victor's gaze lifted sharply. "Don't." Grace whispered, "I brought trouble to your Christmas." Victor stepped closer until their bodies were almost touching. His hands framed her face, forcing her to look at him. "You brought warmth," he said. "You brought life. You brought cookies and laughter and that stubborn mouth that keeps telling me what to do." Grace let out a shaky laugh through her tears. Victor brushed his thumb over her cheek again. "And you brought me a reason to stop living like a ghost." Grace's breath shook. "Victor." He kissed her, slow, steady, not rushing, like the kiss itself was a promise that the fear didn't get to win. When he pulled back, Grace rested her forehead against his. "What happens now?" she whispered. Victor's eyes were calm. "Now you stay here tonight. Tomorrow we get your things. We document everything. And we keep living. Grace searched his face. And us? Victor's voice dropped. Certain. Especially us. Grace's lips parted, emotion flooding her again, but this time it wasn't fear. It was something warmer. Because for the first time, she wasn't facing the past alone. And Ethan Caldwell had just made one mistake he couldn't undo. He'd reminded Victor Romano how much Grace meant to him. And Victor wasn't the kind of man who let go once he decided something was his to protect. Grace woke to the smell of coffee and something sweet. For a second, she forgot where she was. Soft sheets, quiet heat, no traffic noise, no thin apartment walls. Then she remembered Victor's arms around her last night, his voice steady, the way he'd looked at her like she mattered more than the fear. She sat up and listened. The mansion wasn't silent anymore, not because it was loud, because it felt occupied. Grace pulled on the soft robe that had been folded neatly on a chair and stepped into the hallway. Victor's door was open. She found him in the kitchen, sleeves pushed up, hair slightly messy, holding a mug like he'd been awake for hours. He looked up instantly when he saw her. Relief flashed across his face before he could hide it. "Good morning," he said, voice low. Grace's heart warmed. "You made coffee?" Victor lifted a brow. "Don't sound so shocked." Grace walked closer, eyes narrowing at the counter. "Is that pancakes?" Victor's mouth twitched. "It's an attempt." Grace leaned in, sniffed dramatically, then nodded. "Okay, not bad. You might survive without your staff." Victor stepped closer behind her, warm and steady. "I don't want to." Grace turned, confused. "You don't want to survive?" Victor's eyes locked on hers. "I don't want to do this alone anymore." Her throat tightened. "Victor?" He brushed a thumb over her cheek. "Ian handled everything. Your number will change today. We're documenting the messages. And Ethan Caldwell will understand, legally and clearly, that you're not available to him." Grace swallowed. "And if he tries anyway?" Victor's voice was calm. "Then we escalate, but you won't face him alone again. Ever." Grace stared at him, then nodded, the tension in her chest finally loosening. "Okay." They ate at the kitchen island, pancakes slightly uneven, coffee strong, Grace laughing every time Victor tried to pretend he didn't care if she liked it. Halfway through, Grace's phone buzzed. Her stomach tightened, until she remembered. New number in progress. Ian had taken the old phone to copy the messages. This one was Victor's spare device for her until everything switched over. Victor's gaze sharpened anyway. "What is it?" Grace looked at the screen and blinked. A message from Ian. "Restraining order paperwork is ready. Ethan has been served notice through his workplace. He's not coming near her without consequences." Grace exhaled, shoulders dropping like a weight finally slid off. Victor watched her closely. "Talk to me." Grace held up the phone. "It's handled." Victor's jaw flexed. Then he nodded once, like he'd been holding his breath too. Grace's eyes softened. "You really meant it." Victor's voice dropped. "I always mean it." The quiet that followed wasn't tense. It was warm. Grace glanced around the kitchen, his huge counters, the expensive appliances, the clean lines, then smiled. "Your house still needs more life." Victor's brow lifted. "More cookies?" Grace grinned. "More me." Victor stared at her for a beat, then stepped closer, hands sliding to her waist. "Say that again." Grace's cheeks warmed. "More me." Victor kissed her, slow and deep, like he was done holding back from the truth. Grace melted into him, hands on his chest, feeling his heartbeat strong and steady under her palms. When they parted, she whispered, "So, what are we?" Victor didn't hesitate. "Us." Grace laughed softly. "That's not an answer." Victor leaned in, mouth near her ear. "You're my woman." Grace froze, breath catching. "Victor." His voice stayed gentle, not possessive, not controlling, just certain. Not as a label, as a choice, if you want it. Grace searched his face, then nodded, eyes shining. "I want it." Victor kissed her forehead. "Good." Later that day, Victor drove her to get her things. Quiet, discreet, Ian's people nearby without being seen. Grace didn't step into her old apartment alone. Victor walked beside her, calm and steady, carrying her bags like it was the most natural thing in the world. When they returned, the mansion felt different. Grace set her small bag near the stairs, then looked around and smiled like she'd just made a decision. "I'm going to decorate," she announced. Victor blinked. "Decorate what?" Grace pointed at the whole place. "Everything." Victor stared, then muttered, "God help me." Grace laughed. "He already did. He sent me." Victor grabbed her gently by the waist and pulled her close. "Then don't go anywhere." Grace lifted her chin, teasing, "Make me stay." Victor's eyes darkened. Gladly. That night, the mansion had music, soft, warm. It had laughter. It had Grace curled against Victor on the couch, his arm around her, his fingers absent-mindedly tracing her hand like he was memorizing it. Outside, snow fell again. Inside, Victor Romano wasn't lonely. He looked down at Grace and whispered, "Next Christmas." Grace smiled, sleepy and safe. "Yes?" Victor kissed her temple. "We'll have a real table, not one plate." Grace's eyes softened. "Deal." And for the first time in years, Victor believed the future could be simple, because it wouldn't be empty.